Joining me now to weigh in, Shannon Pettypiece, NBC News' newest senior digital White House reporter, David Drucker, senior political correspondent for the Washington Examiner, Maria Teresa Kumar, president and CEO of Voto Latino, an organization dedicated to empowering young Latino voters, and my dearest friend, Charles Sykes, editor-in-chief of The Bulwark, and Brian Klaas is with us, assistant professor of global politics at University College in London and a columnist for The Washington Post. I urge you to read his stuff. It is excellent. Charles, I do want to remind our audience of this. As we talk about these two shootings that took place over the weekend, please let's not forget that 8 days ago, a gunman opened fire at a garlic festival, a food festival in Gilroy, California, killing 3 people, ages 25, 13, and 6. These aren't isolated incidents. Charlie, let's start with the responses we are seeing from lawmakers, from both Republicans and Democrats. Many are saying we have to do something. Democrats saying, Mitch McConnell, let's get out of recess. Let's go to Washington and vote. Yet yesterday, McConnell released a statement saying he wants to work in a bipartisan way to address the mass murders. He didn't mention the word gun once. How does Mitch McConnell get to keep this narrative? We both need to work together. The House is ready to go. Mitch McConnell has blocked this and won't bring it to the floor.
Well, we've seen this movie before, and we know how it ends. We know there's going to be a lot of finger pointing, positioning, and preening, and nothing will happen. Look, there's a very clear sweet spot here. Expanding the background checks, regulating these high-capacity magazines, perhaps finding a way to pass more red flag laws. But I don't think either political party actually is willing to make those kinds of compromises.
Why?
I think they'd rather take it. They'd rather have an issue than a solution. And the reality is that the Republican Party is in the grips of the NRA, and the NRA is not going to concede an inch on all of this.
But
and as long as Republicans.
Every day I hear over and over there are huge rifts in the NRA. They don't have the money and the power that they used to. There are responsible gun owners around the country, and they don't feel that their views are reflected by the NRA. That being the case, how is it that the NRA is all powerful and nothing happens?
Well, all of that is absolutely true, but sometimes a cornered animal is the most dangerous and the least likely to be able to compromise. Look, the gun issue still plays very, strongly in rural areas. In a lot of the places that are going to be the battlegrounds in 2020. I mean, don't underestimate how much of an advantage that issue gave Donald Trump in places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin. And Republicans still think that it is a net plus for them, even though I think there's a real possibility they will be annihilated in the suburbs. But there's just no political will to do this. There's no political courage unless, of course, Donald Trump were to turn around and do something that he's absolutely incapable of doing, which is defying one of his key constituencies and his own base, which is just simply not going to happen.
I'm not sure why common sense overpowers a cornered animal. Considerate humans, cornered animal. David, the president responded yesterday calling for both sides to come together to condemn racism and hate. Those are very positive words. But let's talk action, because it is worth noting that there's a New York Times report that found that since January alone, the president's re-election campaign has posted more than 2,000 ads on Facebook that include the word invasion. How do we stop hate and racism when our own president is the one leading this rhetoric?
Right. So I think this is the contradiction with the president, particularly after events like this, is he often will give a speech, a teleprompter, prepared speech, and he'll say mostly all of the right things. But generally with President Trump, who I like to call Twitter and rally Trump always trumps meeting and teleprompter Trump. Meeting, you're in a one-on-one meeting with the president, and we've seen this after some past shootings, and he'll talk about a desire to implement the kind of gun control that most Republicans would reject. And then quickly that will be unraveled by where he tends to stand on these issues. So I think we have to differentiate between how he acts in the immediate aftermath of an event and what he says subsequently in tweets. And his next rally is August 15th in Manchester, New Hampshire. And I suspect we'll just see more of the same. And there's just such a distinct difference in how he talks about issues depending on the venue.
Invasion, rapists, murderers. That is how he started his 2016 campaign. And invasion seems to be the word du jour. Maria, here's something I'm dying to know. There are a lot of conservative Latinos out there. How do they respond to this rhetoric?
This week has been particularly difficult for the Latino community, Stephanie, because what we're not talking about, sadly, is that this is the second largest white supremacist terror attack against Americans since the Oklahoma City bombing.
Wow.
This was intentional. This man jumped into a car and drove 10 hours to maximize harm. El Paso is considered the safest city in our country, and it's 85% Hispanic. And he aimed to do a hate crime that is heinous, that is terrifying, and he was sending a message that not even in the safest country in the safest city are we safe. And every single Latino in this country right now feels more afraid. I know of folks that are walking around with passports who have been here for generations. We know that it's not just the president's rhetoric, but it's also his policies, from caging babies to creating a denaturalization task force to trying to include a citizenship question in the census. We also know that under Obama, he saw the increase in white supremacy, so he actually created a counter-extremist task force that brought in all these different agencies, from the Department of Education, from the National Security Department to the FBI. And one of the first things that this president did, he dismantled it. He gutted it. So when we talk about rhetoric, it's also policy. He has no interest right now in making the country safe, sadly, even though he reads kind of well from a teleprompter because he didn't know the difference between Toledo and Dayton. But more importantly, he knows that this is his currency. This is how he helps win. That's how he divides America.
But
and
Maria,
while we are
that laundry list that you just went through, every time one of those things occurred, we said, this time it's different. People will come together. They'll say enough is enough. But the reality is the divisions have only gotten deeper. Take me to the Latino community, the conservatives in that community. How do they rationalize what happened this weekend? Do they rationalize the president's words?
Look, I'll show you. Just in Texas alone, Texas alone, in the last election, 2 out of 5 folks that voted in the last election were Hispanic. When we say that we're trying to equivocate the Republican Party and the Democratic Party as almost 50-50, that is not the case. The Republican Party is right now hammered. You have literally a bleeding of individuals that are Republican moderates, independents who know that this is not right. The reason that we were able to transform the House and pass bipartisan legislation for gun safety was because a massive amount of Americans who are patriots went out and voted in 100 years, the most that we've seen, and said this is not the America we want to live in. And the more that we actually talk about the victims of these crimes, the more we actually can elevate the American people who know that this is not who we are. And when the president talks about send us back, he's basically talking about 132 million of us that live in this country. It's not a sliver. It's not a minority. It's 30% of this country. Excuse me, it's 40% of this country. And we have to make sure that we are talking evenly about these news stories, that it's not just through the lens of the Trump voter who is diminishing every single day, and more about this burgeoning American society who actually believes in our future and that the future is that of unity.
Brian, let's talk about a different president and a presidential statement that was released yesterday. I'm talking about our 44th president, Barack Obama. He writes this: we should soundly reject language coming out of the mouths of any of our leaders that feeds a climate of fear and hatred or normalizes racist statements. It doesn't take a genius to say he's talking to President Trump.
Yeah, and President Trump knew that he was talking about him, which I think is very telling. President Trump knows what he's doing when he's stoking racism and when he's spreading racism. And I think what you have to look at here is there's 2 issues that are coming together in places like El Paso. One of them is President Trump mainstreaming hatred and bigotry. So, he didn't build the wood on the bonfire, but he certainly poured gasoline on it and lit the match and then saw what happens. And then beyond that, you also have the easy access to guns, which is the difference in the rest of the world from the United States. I mean, I've lived in the UK for 8 years. There's not been one mass shooting here in that time, right? The reason for that is there is not easy access to guns, and there's not easy access to semi-automatic assault rifles. There's not easy access to clips that hold 100 rounds where you can fire 45 bullets in the span of 30 seconds. and there's actually legislation to prevent these things from happening. So I think the combination, this dangerous cocktail of white nationalism mainstreamed by the president, the hatred coming out of the White House, and on top of that, easy access to guns for people who should frankly not have them, is a very dangerous and deadly one. And we're going to be here doing this again if nothing changes.
Brian, stay on that, because that is what you just wrote about, your piece. The world thinks America's gun laws are crazy, and they're right. We know that this populist uprising is happening around the world, specifically in England where you are. What do they think of our gun situation? Because that is the one thing that's different here. Our hate has translated into things like what happened over the weekend.
I mean, to put it bluntly, they think we're completely bonkers. You know, this is something where in 1996 there was a school shooting in Dunblane in Scotland, and there was a sweeping response by the government to deal with guns. And there's only been one mass shooting since then in 2010. Gun crime is extremely low in the United Kingdom, and the gun murder rate, or the gun homicide rate in the UK is 73 times lower than it is in the United States. Every other country that's rich on the planet has solved this problem. The only country that refuses to do anything to solve it with data-driven evidence of how we could do that is the United States, and it's the fault of our leaders, not the fault of our individual citizens. We need to actually vote out people who refuse to do common sense reform the way that every other developed country on the planet has.
Shannon, President Trump is set to visit both of these cities in the coming days. What are we going to expect?
Well, it'll be one more day where this issue is in the headlines. But, I mean, when you look at the news cycle and how many of these shootings we have, I'm not sure if by Friday we will still be talking and thinking about this issue. There are at least 15 times the White House has had to respond to some sort of mass shooting over this administration's term. Sometimes it's just a tweet, sometimes it's remarks at an oval spray, sometimes it's as big as this where there's an actual location visit. But then this White House and this administration moves on. Even after the Parkland shooting, when they brought in victims, and I was with the president when he went and visited some of the victims in the hospital. And that seemed like a moment where members of Congress were going to get together and do something. Nothing changed. Nothing moved on. On Friday, the president leaves to Bedminster for a summer holiday. There is no sign Congress is coming back. Mitch McConnell put out a statement that gave no indication that he was going to be taking any sort of new course or new direction on this. So I do feel like we will have these headlines on Wednesday when the president makes his visit. But by next week, this White House will have moved on to something else. And I do not think it will change the conversation about immigration in any way, because that is still a #1 issue for the president's campaign. It is a #1 issue for Republican voters, and it's still a top issue for a lot of moderate voters out there. So we have a rally August 15th, and I am sure some of the regular immigration talking points will be in that again as well.
So Mitch McConnell's not changing direction, but Charles, take me to your home state of Wisconsin. It is not just mass shootings. The Gun Violence Archive found that there have been more than 33,000 gun incidents in the U.S. this year. Just this weekend in Chicago, 59 people were shot, 7 of them killed. Other countries are warning of our gun culture. Japan calling the U.S. a gun society. In Wisconsin, where there is a hunting and fishing culture, where that is part of your society, this isn't the gun culture that you all believe in. How do Wisconsin voters take to this reality? Still, don't touch any of my guns?
Well, first of all, 7 years ago yesterday, we had a mass shooting here in the Milwaukee area where a Sikh temple was shot up by a gunman. So we know this is something that has hit home. Well, I was always struck by this gap between the absolutist position of the NRA and the rather common sense approach that most gun owners and hunters have in places like Wisconsin. I mean, no deer hunter needs a magazine with 100 bullets. You know, no deer hunter needed a bump stock. So there is that gap. On the other hand, the NRA and the Republicans have become very, very cynical in playing on fears that the Democrats want to take their guns away from them, and they will play that card again and again. On the other hand, you do wonder whether or not there is at some point a tipping point. I thought that Newtown was a tipping point. I thought that the shootings were a tipping point. And as Shannon just mentioned, you know, none of these conversations actually ever changed. Parkland, we thought was going to change everything, but it didn't really move the conversation. So when Congress comes back in September, are voters going to be clamoring, or will we have moved on to something else? I just don't know. I do think this is a moment, though, for moral leadership, because I do think that there is a common sense core, even among strong, you know, gun rights activists who simply are looking at this gun culture and saying enough is enough.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.